Airplanes in war, an idea that was left largely unexplored until the First World War. First used by the Italians against Turkey in 1911, its widespread use would not come until 1914. At first, airplanes in war had little to no impact on the battles that were fought underneath them, but with slight developments increasing their range, altitude, and speed, while decreasing their cost, it became easier to run planes, for one of the many uses that they would develop during the war. Their role in war changed drastically over the 4 years, going from just being used as surveillance to being armed with several weapons and bombs. The First World War was what ignited the fight for superiority in the air, and would change the rules of combat from then on. At the start of the war, the use of aircrafts in warfare was rather insignificant, but with the advent of trench warfare across the Eastern Front, both sides began to fly surveillance aircraft to gather information on the enemy's trenches. Surveillance was very effective, and both sides soon started to employ their tactics. It must be taken into consideration as to what they were flying. Planes such as the BE-2 biplanes flew surveillance missions, and were often extremely dangerous to fly. They were made largely out of wood and fabric, with very little metal and other things that are seen in aircraft construction these days. Planes were extremely dangerous to fly, for this reason being extremely unreliable and delicate. As well as this, they weren't very fast, topping at 160 km per hour if all went their way, and a maximum of 14,000 feet, minuscule amounts in aviation today. With developments, these planes were turned into the first light bombers, carrying out bombings. Due to this, arming planes became necessary, with machine guns attached to the back of surveillance planes for the observers, as seen in the FB-5 gun bus. However, it soon became obvious that this solution wasn't effective, and gave rise to the first real fighter aircrafts in history. Up until this point, aircrafts had contributed very little to the outcomes of the battles, but this would soon change. With 1915 came the first real fighter aircraft, which was made in France by Roland Garros. It included a forward-mounted machine gun with modified propellers that were thinner and protected by metal wedges against the bullets that the machine gun would fire. His plane, the Morane-Saulnier, was later shot down and duplicated by the Germans. Fokker, a German aircraft company, came up with a synchronizer which rotated the machine gun at the same pace as the propeller so as to not hit the propeller with its own bullets. Countries also started to make their own counterparts of this, and the first signs of a proper aerial war was actually starting to be seen. Small skirmishes over the battlefields evolved into massive dogfights. Aerial combat actually started to reflect in progress in wars. With planes having the capability of taking out entire enemy trenches, some practices seen commonly in aerial combat today initially started off in World War I. It was at this point that dogfighting became a common occurrence in the air above battlefields. A dogfight is a battle between military aircrafts at close range. Fight pilots learned how to push the limits of their delicate and slow planes to benefit from them, becoming famous because of it. Manfred von Richthofen, dubbed the Red Baron, was widely regarded as the best fighter pilot of the time, amassing 80 wins. Another pilot from this era that was famous was Roland Garros, who was considered as the first to fire a real fighter plane, and is remembered in the form of the French Open, which is called the Roland Garros. However, it wasn't always this great for pilots. Many of the pilots flew in the massive squadrons had less than 15 hours of solo flying experience, and were often in their young 20s, trying to avoid getting into the military or the navy. Pilots had very low life expectancy, often being counted in weeks and months instead of years, and due to the dangerous planes that they were flying, it became really difficult to survive. With the rapid development of aerial warfare in World War I, a third dimension was added, which had heavy implications on the result of the war. Along with tanks, planes had completely wiped out the use of trench warfare, and many cities that were previously considered impermeable collapsed due to aerial attacks. While their impact can be overlooked as a developing battlefield, it did affect the outcome of World War I. In conclusion, while uncommon at the advent of war, planes developed and became an integral part of success in World War I and the wars to come from then on. Over the course of war, certain planes such as the Morale Soldier, the Fokker DR-1, and others completely revolutionized the airspace, and at the time would increase the dependence on the Air Force. It would also be the reason the RAF, FASF, and the IGFC were created. World War I was the point at which the Air Force became integral to the success in a war.